All right, man, peace. So as I'm sure many of you brothers who follow professional sports know by now, Hank Aaron, the Major League Baseball legend and arguably the all-time greatest player in the history of the sport, was removed, and the official date that was given for his removal was January 22nd, 2021. Now, of course, numerologically, that comes out to 12221, which adds to the point, at least I suspect, that many of these assets are removed on a date that's different from the date that's officially given to the public, so that the public can receive the date that's meant to represent a numerological resonance. What I mean by that is it's possible that many of these people pass away, say, for example, on the 16th or the 18th, but it's not announced to the people until the 22nd, so that it can be seared into their subconscious mind that the person passed away on a date that's going to resonate within their subconscious mind in a particular way, because that's the power of numbers. You don't have to be aware of what the significance is for the spell to be cast upon you if you're not aware of what's being done to you. But just to get back to the point, Hank Aaron was an all-time great athlete, an all-time great baseball player, and he was indeed very fortunate to be a part of professional sports in an era where the media did not particularly care what you were doing off the field. Everything back then was much more smoke and mirrors. It was about performance and appearance. As long as you spoke with decorum and class, they didn't care how much drugs you were doing off the field. They didn't care about how many women you were popping off the field. They didn't care about how many families you had. They didn't care about the PEDs that you were using, because PEDs were widespread in baseball from the 1930s and 40s. That's not just something that started to happen in the 1990s with Barry Bonds and Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa. That's all bullshit. Steroids came into the major leagues in the 1960s and 1970s. And Major League Baseball players were using cocaine, methamphetamines, and barbiturates to both bring themselves up and bring themselves down before and after games. So, for example, if you had maybe a doubleheader that day, a doubleheader, for those of you who don't know, who don't follow baseball, is when you play 2 games in one day. A player might use methamphetamines to get themselves up for the game. Or if you had a day game after a night game. So, for example, if you played at 7:30 p.m. the night before the next day, where you might play at 1:30 p.m. and you had to be able to be extremely focused for that game, you might use meth. I believe that they called it greenies. Or I should say, I believe that they called those drugs greenies. Well, you had certain players who would confess that they would come into the clubhouse and they would be like a candy dish in the middle of the clubhouse, and players would take methamphetamines to make sure that their focus was hyper acute for the game, and so that they could perform on a higher level. And, you know, not to try to cast aspersions on Hank Aaron's career, but there was a moment in the early 70s where he'd fallen off. And all of a sudden, both he and his teammate Davey Johnson, and I believe another teammate on the Atlanta Braves, had huge 40-plus home run seasons almost out of nowhere, when it appeared as if, you know, his career was starting to dial down. And there were some suspicions that he was using some type of performance-enhancing drug, as well as his teammates. So I say all that to say this. The scrutiny that's placed on Barry Bonds to try to invalidate what he was able to accomplish in the major leagues, to me, is a little bit overboard. Barry Bonds was a part of an era, and players have to be evaluated according to their era. So in an era where all the players, or basically the vast majority of the prominent players, were using performance-enhancing drugs, Barry Bonds was still by far the most productive. But just to get back to Hank Aaron was just like all the other elite level athletes from back in the 50s and 60s. He was a Luciferian as well, or what they call a quote-unquote Mason. And his life was basically salvaged by fellow Masons, especially when he was starting to decline in regards to his overall life success. But I'll be covering that more in depth in the series that I do on Clarence Avant, the quote-unquote Black Godfather. That's the advantage of being a part of the, the Luciferian guild per se, or the quote-unquote brotherhood. They will look out for you when you start to decline. That happened with Joe Louis when his life started to decline. Frank Sinatra looked out for him. Now, I believe that Henry Aaron's last act for the brotherhood was to make himself a guinea pig for the COVID-19 quote-unquote vaccine, or as I call it, the 666 vaccine, a sacrificial lamb per se, to try to encourage the Most High sheep, that being the so-called blacks of their captivity, to trust it and to take it and to alter their DNA genome, their RNA, Please understand that once you're beholden to the craft, you must do whatever they say, almost to the point where you willingly believe everything that they say. And I do believe that that's what happened to Mr. Henry Aaron. But anyway, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
All right, moving on to Hank Aaron, one of the greatest baseball players, one of the greatest professional athletes of all time.
Arguably the greatest baseball player of all time. And obviously, I never saw him play. He was retired well before I was born. But fortunately for me, I have resources that I can go to inquire and ask of how dominant was he. My father likens him to that era's version of an Albert Pujols. He wasn't someone who was ever going to hit 55 or 60 home runs, but he consistently was hitting in the mid to high 30s into the lower 40s. And he was known for his amazing bat speed. I remember back in the 90s, I'm not quite sure if baseball has this now, but at one point, baseball had a bat speed tracker, especially on ESPN, Sunday Night Baseball. They had this bat speed tracker where you could tell, and it really helped bring home what made an explosive hitter, particularly a home run hitter. Because all the top home run hitters in Major League Baseball would always have the highest bat speed. Ken Griffey Jr., Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, they would consistently have bat speeds in the high 90s. I remember when Mark McGwire hit that 500 plus, almost 600 foot home run in the Kingdome against Randy Johnson. And it was because Randy Johnson was throwing 100 miles an hour and Mark McGwire was swinging 100 miles an hour. So I say all that to say Henry Aaron most likely had bat speed somewhere around that as well, because he was known for his explosively fast wrists. Back in the day, they used to have these reruns of the old school Major League Baseball home run hitting contests. And you see Ernie Banks against Hank Aaron, and Willie Mays against Eddie Matthews, and Mickey Mantle against Harmon Killebrew or something like that. And it would always amaze me to see these guys, that you read about in baseball almanacs and stuff like that, out there trying to compete for a couple $100. It shows you how times have changed. But Hank Aaron, when you look up his stats, he was an incredible baseball player. And like all other superlative athletes, at some point in time, he did meet with Papa Legba. I'm talking about the creme de la creme of the athletes, the ones who are able to receive great fame and adulation and notoriety. They did meet with Papa Legba, or the quote-unquote GOAT God, at the crossroads. That's why you'll notice that all these guys always end up being Masons. That's part of their overall life script. Willie Mays was no different.
Friday morning, he was 86 years old. Of course, most people know him for breaking Babe Ruth's sacred home run record when he hit his 715th home run back in the day. An amazing moment, iconic moment. To think that this man started in the Negro Leagues and worked his way in. And by the way, you've heard his story a bazillion times, I'm sure. The hatred and the vitriol that this man was forced to endure as he rose up to prominence, and especially when he was breaking Babe Ruth's record. A lot of racists were speaking out and harassing him a lot, and he dealt with it with a stoic demeanor that just everybody respected it.
I mean, he's a 25-time All-Star. He's undoubtedly one of the 5 greatest baseball players of all time. If it's possible to be that great and still be underrated, that was Hank Aaron.
Hank Aaron said that he was all set to sign with the baseball giants, but then out of nowhere, the Braves offered him a contract for $50 more a month or something like that. He was that close to playing in the same outfield with Willie Mays. And isn't it amazing? Both Willie Mays and Hank Aaron are from Alabama. An amazing hotbed for baseball talent, for athletic talent, period. I think that Willie McCovey was also from Alabama, if I remember correctly.
An absolute gentleman on and off the field. If you listen to anybody who covered him, knew him, was friends with him, they all have great things to say about Hank Aaron. It's incredible.
He was a hero, not just during his playing days, but long after. As a matter of fact, the last story we did on Hank Aaron was just a couple of weeks ago. We got him and his wife at the Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta.
Yeah, when they used him as a guinea pig for the COVID-19 vaccine. Please keep in mind that Morehouse is one of the upper crust elite boule institutions, along with Howard University, Spelman, so on and so forth.
Getting his COVID vaccine, and the reason that the Aarons were so adamant about doing this publicly with media there was because they wanted to set an example for other African Americans.
No, it was because Henry Aaron was told by his brothers in the craft that this is what he must do. That's why they did that and organized a media spectacle about it. But that's normally how things turn out for many of these assets.
That the COVID vaccine was safe, and they wanted the community to be healthy, and they wanted to show we're not just talking the talk here, we're walking the walk. We are in the clinic getting our vaccine.
And you see Henry Aaron right there, surrounded, of course, by the liberal black female who's going to be used or is being used to shepherd the so-called black community towards the application of the COVID-19 vaccine.
A leader and a hero right up until the end. Renee, you're in Atlanta right now. What's the mood in Atlanta?
Yeah, it's a sad mood. Just losing a legend like we talked about. And not.
This chick is such a poser. I have to do a video about her because I've found some backdrops pertaining to many of the woke anchors or the woke sports pundits on Fox Sports 1. An excellent backdrop pertaining to her, Emmanuel Acho, Shannon Sharpe, etc. This chick basically confessed that she just got woke in 2020 after the George Floyd murder. And now all of a sudden they have her all over television trying to act like she's some type of leader or shepherd. It's just laughable. It's a fucking joke. The liberal black woman takes activism and race talk as a mode for attention mongering. Nothing is truly serious to them. Particularly if a so-called black man actually knows what he's talking about. They will use a female like Renee Montgomery to try to shut him down, because they need the race talk to stay on a two-dimensional level.
His accolades, and I'm so glad that Babcock and you all mentioned his accolades, because that needs to be talked about, especially coming from the Negro League, where a lot of people didn't even want to acknowledge those stats. Like, a lot of people didn't want to have a part of those stats. So yeah, he had a lot of turmoil, just cross.
I think that she's confused maybe with Josh Gibson. Now, in regards to Josh Gibson, Major League Baseball has recently decided that they're going to acknowledge his stats from the Negro Leagues, which would make Josh Gibson the official all-time home run leader. Whether or not they're going to actually follow through on that, we'll see. But there's no need to acknowledge Hank Aaron's Negro League stats because he has the greatest Major League Baseball stats of all time.
And being great. Like, people had a problem with him being great, and he embraced it. He talked about how he wanted to be remembered, and he deserves to be remembered. So yeah, it's tough losing someone, and like we said, right up into it, just got the COVID test, just leave.
No, he just received the COVID vaccine. That's what he received, and that's why he's no longer here. But the mainstream liberal media is not going to cover it in that way because they have to promote the vaccine, especially towards the so-called black community. And the so-called black community, or the quote-unquote Aboriginal community, has been targeted for the applying of the vaccine from the very beginning, which should, pique the understanding or cause the antennas to sprout on the heads of those of us who are acutely aware of what many of the strategies are of the powers that be when it comes to, certain agendas and certain programs that are targeted towards the masses at large, but focus on the so-called black community. So many people say that, well, the vaccine was rushed. They never had a real chance to test it out. Well, who do you think the test subjects are if they never actually had a chance to test it out, but now they claim to be focusing on the so-called black community? You're the test case.
By example, throughout his whole career. So we lost a legend here in Atlanta and the world.
R.I.P. Hammer and Hank Aaron, a legend.
But anyway, that's basically it on that. As we can see here, once again, the official date given of his removal is January 22nd, which is 1-2221. So that's the basic numerology on the demise of Mr. Hank Aaron, or the quote-unquote home run king. And he wears the number 44, which stands for destruction. So who knows what his actual demise is meant to represent or initiate, but I'm sure that we'll be finding out sometime later this year. So peace.